Jet fuel smells nothing like gasoline. It's thinner, cleaner, almost medicinal. And the moment it hit the ventilation system of St. Marguerite Regional, Stellan knew something had gone catastrophically wrong somewhere inside a 30-kilometer radius. She was in the supply room on the second floor, counting wound dressings. That was her job today. Not triage, not assessment. Counting wound dressings, because charge nurse Beliveau had assigned her to the supply room the same way you assign a child to sort crayons, to keep them occupied and out of the way. Stellan, you're floating today. Beliveau had said it that morning, without looking up from her clipboard, the words clipped and bureaucratic. We had a call-out. You'll cover supply, linen rotation, and discharge paperwork on 3. Stay out of eMERG. My team has it handled. Stellan had said of course, and meant it. She was 34 years old. She had been a float nurse at St. Marguerite Regional for 11 months. She had been a combat medic with the Canadian Armed Forces for 6 years before that, deployed twice, once to Mali, once somewhere she still couldn't discuss at dinner parties. She had triaged casualties in the dark with her hands because the power had been cut and the flashlight had been shot out. She had kept a man's trachea open with a bent piece of field tubing and a prayer. She had done things in the sand and the heat and the dark that the Nursing Registration Board of New Brunswick would never have approved. Now, she counted wound dressings. 4x4 gauze, sterile, 62 packs ABD pads, 31. Non-stick Telfa, 19. The counting helped. It was repetitive and small and asked nothing of her. That was the point. She had not chosen St. Marguerite Regional for its excellent reputation. She had chosen it because it was a level 3 facility in a mid-sized city, where nobody knew her, where the cases were manageable and the stakes were low, and where she could exist without anyone expecting anything from her that she was not prepared to give. She had chosen it the same way she chose her apartment. Ground floor, no balcony, one lock on the door, clear sightlines to the street. Safe, contained, quiet. She had been doing well. 11 months of doing well, of being invisible. Bellevau's voice crackled over the intercom. All staff, code orange, ER staff to emergency positions. All non-essential personnel, stay clear of the ambulance bay. Stellan set down the gauze packs. The jet fuel smell was stronger now. She walked to the supply room's small window. The parking lot 3 floors below was. She stopped, blinked, looked again. A CH-146 Griffin was sitting in the east end of the visitor parking lot. Rotors still turning. Its olive drab fuselage throwing rotor wash against the parked minivans and sedans. Beside it, 2 figures in multicam had already jumped clear and were pulling a litter from the cargo bay. A second helicopter, she could hear it now, the deep syncopated thrum vibrating up through the building's concrete skeleton, was circling low, looking for a landing point. Not a medevac, not a civilian bird. The litter carriers were moving fast, tactically fast, not the hurried jog of paramedics, the ground-eating sprint of people who have moved casualties under fire. Stellan's hands had stopped moving. She noticed this the way you notice a clock has stopped, with a sudden disorienting stillness. She did not run downstairs. She stood at the window for a long count of 3, willing her pulse to stay level, and then she walked to the stairwell door and went down. The ER was already in controlled chaos by the time she reached the ground floor. Through the reinforced glass of the hallway door, she could see Bellevaux at the charge desk, phone pressed to her ear, her composure visibly eroding. Dr. Tetreault, the senior attending, was pulling on gloves and barking at the junior residents. The overhead lights felt too bright. The monitors chimed in their irregular, overlapping rhythms. Stellan pushed through the door and stepped into the hallway. "You're not supposed to be an Immerg." That was what Beliveau would say if she noticed. Beliveau did not notice. She was too busy arguing with whoever was on the phone. The ambulance doors blew open. They came through in a tight formation, 3 of them in full kit. Plate carriers, dusty, faces unreadable. The 4th was on the litter, and Stellan saw in a single glance what was wrong with him. Bilateral blast injuries to the lower legs, active hemorrhage through improvised field dressings on the right, tourniquet high and tight on the left. His face was the gray-white of blood loss. He was conscious, barely. "Make a hole," the lead operator said. He wasn't yelling. The tone was worse than yelling. It was the specific, controlled volume of someone who has already decided that nothing in this room is going to stop them. He was big, with a close-cut beard and a corporal's rank on his chest. His eyes swept the ear the way a person sweeps a room for exits. Dr. Tetreault moved forward with the professional authority of a 20-year attending. "I'm the physician in charge. What have we got? What unit are? Bilateral traumatic amputations, partial on the right, complete on the left below the knee." The lead operator spoke over him without looking at him. "TQ applied in field 22 minutes ago. Blood pressure was dropping in transit. He's been in and out." He set his end of the litter down on the nearest trauma bay gurney with a practiced ease. "He needs blood, and he needs it now. We've got type on file. O negative, factor 8, deficiency." Right. Tetreault's training reasserted itself. Massive transfusion protocol. "Get me O neg from the blood bank now." Page hematology. He was reaching for the patient when the lead operator's hand came down on his forearm. Not grabbing, just resting. But it stopped Tetreault cold. "He also has a hemothorax." The operator said it quietly. "Right side. We didn't have the gear to drain it in the field. He's been compensating, but his SATs have been sliding for the last 10 minutes. You need to do that first." Tetreault stared at him. "How do you know it's a hemothorax?" "Because I watched him get hit." The operator's jaw was set, "and because I've seen it before." Something shifted in the trauma bay. Not quite panic, more like the specific suspended uncertainty oppression of professionals who have encountered something outside the parameters of their training. The junior residents looked at Tetreault. The nurses looked at each other. Beliveau, who had materialized at the bay entrance at some point, was clutching her incident binder and looking at the patient with the expression of someone who had just realized the textbook they memorized did not cover this chapter. Stellan was standing at the edge of the bay. She had positioned herself against the wall beside the supply cabinet. Habit, not strategy. From here, she could see the patient's chest rising. It was asymmetric, right side lagging. His color was worse than it had looked from across the room. The SAT monitor, one of the nurses had just clipped to his finger, was reading 89 and descending. The right side breath sounds. She already knew what they would tell her before anyone put a stethoscope on him. "Someone needs to make a decision," the operator said. He wasn't looking at Tetreault anymore. He was looking at the monitoring equipment. "His SATs are in the 80s. You have maybe 5 minutes before this becomes a different kind of problem. We are working on it." Tetreault's voice had an edge in it now. "If you'll let my team, Tetreault." The junior resident, a young woman named Dr. Uwali, had a stethoscope on the patient's chest. Her face had gone still in the particular way that medical people's faces go still when the news is exactly as bad as feared. Breath sounds absent on the right. I think he's right. The operative word being, I think. Tetro hesitated. 1 second. 2. It was the hesitation of a good clinician, confronting a presentation he'd seen in textbooks and simulations, but not often in a level 3 ER at a regional hospital on a Thursday afternoon in Moncton. The patient's sat dropped to 86. Stellan pushed off the wall. She didn't say anything. She crossed the bay in 4 steps, moved around Dr. Uwali with a quiet "excuse me" that was not actually a question, and picked up the stethoscope from the tray before anyone had registered she was there. She listened. Left, clear, if shallow. Right, silence, not diminished. Absent. She set the stethoscope down. He needs a chest drain. Her voice was level, not loud. She was already scanning the bay, cataloging what was on the trays, what was in the cabinet. Right side, 5th intercostal, mid-axillary. Has someone called for a thoracostomy tray? The bay went quiet in a way that was different from the previous quiet. Beliveau found her voice first. "Excuse me." "Tight. You are not. I know what I am." Stellan didn't turn around. She'd found the thoracostomy tray on the lower shelf of the equipment cart, still sealed in its sterile packaging. She checked the label. Good. Recent. Someone needs to consent this patient. He's conscious. Can he consent? She looked at the operator. He looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating in real time. Not hostility, but the sharp appraisal of someone reassessing a variable they'd written off. "Erickson," the operator said. He leaned into the patient's field of vision. "Corporal Erickson, can you hear me?" The man on the gurney, Erickson, apparently, made a sound that was not a word but communicated unmistakable comprehension. "The nurse is going to put a drain in your chest. It's going to hurt. Do you understand?" Erickson's hand moved, barely, thumb up. "That is not a valid," Beliveau started. "It's valid enough for the next 4 minutes," Stellan said. She was already tearing open the packaging. "Tetro," she said, his name without looking at him. "I need you to manage his MTP while I do this." "Can you do that?" There was a pause that lasted as long as it took for Dr. Tetro to process the fact that a float nurse had just assigned him a task. "Yes," he said, and his voice was careful and deliberate and something like relieved. He turned to the blood bank tech, who had appeared in the doorway. "Let's go. Oneg. Factor 8. Follow the protocol." Stellan snapped on her gloves. The operator moved to the far side of the gurney, opposite her, and braced Erickson's right arm up and out of the way without being asked. Stellan noted this. He'd done this before, or something like it. He knew which side to be on. "I'm going to clean the site," she said to Erickson. And she did, and she worked quickly and without preamble, because time was the only resource she had, and it was running out. The bupivacaine she loaded into the local anesthetic syringe was not enough. It would never be enough for a chest drain. She knew that. Erickson probably knew that. "Sharp pressure," she said, and then she made the incision. She had done this in better conditions. She had done this in far worse. She had done it in the back of a lav, in the dark, with the vehicle moving, which was exactly as much fun as it sounds. She knew the anatomy the way she knew her own hands, the 5th intercostal space, just anterior to the mid-axillary line, avoiding the neurovascular bundle at the inferior rib margin. The Kelly forceps went in. She spread. Erickson made a sound through his teeth that she cataloged and filed away and did not let touch her. "Almost there," she said, and meant it. Her gloved finger found the pleural space. She swept it clear. Tube. Dr. Uwali, who had positioned herself at the tray without being directed, slapped the drain into Stellan's waiting hand. Stellan guided it in, posterior and superior, fed it deep. Dark blood rushed through the tubing, a lot of it. The right quantity of it, not the catastrophic arterial hemorrhage. That would have meant a different kind of evening, but the expected accumulation of a hemothorax. Connect to the pleurovac, Stellan said. Uali was already doing it. The machine gurgled, pulling fluid, and Ericsson's next breath was fuller than the one before it. The SAT monitor climbed, 91, 93. There you go, Stellan said, mostly to herself. She stepped back from the gurney. Her gloves were bloody to the wrists. Her heart was moving at a pace she was actively managing downward. The fluorescent lights felt very bright, the way they always do when adrenaline starts metabolizing. SATs are climbing, Dr. Uali said. Her voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. She was looking at Stellan the way people look at something they hadn't seen properly before. 95. Good. Stellan stripped off the outer gloves and looked at Tetro. His transfusion is more important than my documentation right now. You'll want a trauma surgeon for the legs. Does St. Marguerite have one on call today, or do you need to transfer? We have Guerrero on call. Tetro said this the way people say things when they are following a conversation that moved faster than they expected. She's been paged. Good. Stellan reached for a clean towel from the supply shelf and pressed it against the front of her scrub top. The blood wasn't hers. It didn't matter. Her hands were still shaking slightly, the fine tremor she'd learned to expect and ignore. Then you're set. She turned to go. The lead operator stepped into her path. Not aggressively, he simply appeared there, the way large people in small spaces sometimes do. Up close, he was older than she'd estimated. Late 30s, maybe. There was a specific kind of tired in his face that she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror. Corporal Desjardins, he said. JTF2. He said it quietly, not for the room. Stellan looked at him. That's a pretty specific skill set for a float nurse, Desjardins said. St. Marguerite covers a broad scope of practice. Her voice was flat. He almost smiled, not quite. Where were you? She knew what he was asking. It wasn't a question about geography. Mali, she said, and then somewhere else. Desjardins nodded. He understood somewhere else. His unit probably had a somewhere else of their own. You saved his legs, Desjardins said. Or, the surgeons will, now that his chest isn't killing him first. But you know what I mean. She did know what he meant. She didn't say anything. How long have you been floating? 11 months. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the trauma bay had transformed from stalled uncertainty into the specific productive motion of a team that knew what to do next. Tetro was managing the transfusion. Uali was monitoring the drain output. Two other nurses Stellan didn't know by name were coordinating the ore prep. Things were moving. Things were moving because the drain was in. We lost someone, Desjardins said. His voice had changed, gone to a lower register. 2 weeks ago, our medic. We've been running short since. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact to someone he judged capable of receiving facts. I'm sorry, Stellan said. She meant it. You were CAF, yes. Medical tech? She looked at him steadily. Among other things, another almost smile. He reached into a cargo pocket of his plate carrier and produced something, a subdued flash, the JTF2 unit identifier, worn fabric stiff with fieldwork. He set it on the supply cabinet beside her. You don't have to take that, he said, but I wanted you to have the option. Stellan looked at the patch. She didn't touch it. Corporal Erickson, she said. He has a factor deficiency. Make sure whoever takes over his care has that in the handoff. It'll affect his clotting during surgery. Already told Tetro. Tell Guerrero directly. Don't assume it travels through the chart. It doesn't, always. Desjardins looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way people nod when they have been given a useful piece of information by someone who knows what they're talking about. "I'll tell her directly," he said. He stepped aside. Stellan walked out of the trauma bay. The bathroom on the ground floor had a deep industrial sink and harsh overhead lighting that did her no favors. She ran the water cold and scrubbed her hands methodically, the way she'd been taught, and the way she'd learned again, and the way she did it every time, because some habits are worth keeping, regardless of how the rest of your life has rearranged itself. The shaking in her hands was subsiding. She braced both forearms on the rim of the sink and looked at the drain. The water ran clear, the copper smell faded. She was aware of the fluorescent buzz of the light, the faint ambient sound of the hospital around her, the paging system, the squeak of gurney wheels in the corridor, someone's radio down the hall. The ordinary, continuous texture of a place where people came to be put back together. 11 months. She'd been doing well, genuinely. She had a routine and a small apartment, and a cat named after a glacier, and a physiotherapist who was slowly convincing her that her left knee was not going to give out entirely if she walked more than 2 kilometers. She had managed to go 11 months without anyone asking anything of her, that she couldn't answer by counting wound dressings and updating discharge paperwork. She turned off the tap. The bathroom door opened. She didn't turn around. "I figured you'd be in here," Beliveau said. Stellan watched her own reflection in the mirror above the sink. Beliveau looked different in the doorway than she had at the charge desk. Smaller, somehow, not diminished, recalibrated. I need to document what happened in that trauma bay," Beliveau said, and her voice was careful in a way it hadn't been this morning. "Administration is going to have questions about scope of practice and procedural authorization, and there's a process. I know there's a process." Stellan dried her hands on the paper towel. "Document accurately. I performed a needle thoracostomy and placed a chest tube on an unconscious. He wasn't unconscious. On a patient in extremis who provided verbal consent. Dr. Tetro was present. Dr. Uwali was present. The operators from JTF2 were present." She looked at Beliveau in the mirror. "Document what happened." Beliveau was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell anyone you had this training?" Stellan turned around and faced her properly. "It was a reasonable question. It deserved a reasonable answer. Because I didn't want to use it," Stellan said. "I came here to be a float nurse, to cover call-outs and count N95s, and not be anyone's first option for anything. That was the agreement I made with myself." She paused. "There wasn't a room full of people who needed me to be anything else until this afternoon." Beliveau looked at her for a long time. There was something working behind her eyes. Not apology exactly, but a close cousin. "The corporal is stable," Beliveau said finally. "Guerrero's taken him to the OR. Tetro says, and I am quoting him, that without the drain, he'd have coated in the bay." Stellan said nothing. "That's not nothing," Beliveau said. "No," Stellan agreed. "It isn't." Silence sat between them, not uncomfortable. The paging system chimed once, distantly. A voice called a name that didn't belong to either of them. "Take the rest of the shift," Beliveau said. "If you want it. The supply room can wait." Stellan considered this. "I'd like to finish the inventory," she said. "I was at the wound dressings. Non-stick Telfa 19. Beliveau opened her mouth, closed it, nodded once. She left. Stellan stood alone in the bathroom for another minute. She looked at her hands. Steady now. The fine tremor had resolved the way it always resolved, not with rest, but with something to do. She thought about the patch on the supply cabinet. She had not taken it, and she had not thrown it away, and it was sitting there in the trauma bay waiting for her to decide something. She was good at deferring decisions. 11 months had taught her that. You could defer a lot of things by counting gauze and emptying bedpans and becoming, deliberately, the least interesting person in any room you entered. The problem, and she was beginning to understand this as a problem, was that the room always, eventually, had someone in it who was going to die unless someone did something, and she was always, eventually, the someone who could. She'd hated every second of it, standing at that gurney. The smell of blood and jet fuel and institutional antiseptic all wound together. The specific weight of being the person who knows what to do. She'd hated it the way you hate something you're very good at that costs you something every time. But Erickson had a pulse. His sats were 95 and climbing. There was a surgeon closing his legs in OR2 right now. She walked back to the elevator, pressed 2. The supply room was exactly as she'd left it. Fluorescent light, neat shelves, the quiet hum of the ventilation system, and 62 packs of sterile 4x4 gauze waiting to be counted. She picked up the clipboard. She went back for the patch at end of shift. The trauma bay had been cleaned, restocked, reset into its ordinary pristine waiting. The gurney had a fresh sheet. The blood was gone from the floor. If you hadn't been there, you'd have had no idea. The supply cabinet was where she'd left it, against the east wall. The patch was still there. She stood in front of it for a moment. The trauma bay was empty. The evening shift was quiet. The code orange had been stood down 2 hours ago, and whatever paperwork Beliveau had feared had apparently been handled by a phone call between Dr. Tetro and someone at administration, because nobody had paged Stellan and nobody had asked her to fill out anything she wasn't prepared to fill out. She picked up the patch. It was smaller than she remembered. The fabric was worn at the edges, stiff in the center, with something she didn't examine closely. It was the kind of object that carries weight disproportionate to its size. The kind that means something specific to a very specific kind of person, and nothing at all to anyone else's. She closed her fingers around it. She did not put it back. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She did not know if this afternoon was an anomaly, or a beginning, or simply a Thursday that would fade into the fabric of 11 months of Thursdays. She did not know if she was going to tell her physiotherapist about it, or her landlord, or the cat. What she knew was that her hands had stopped shaking before the Pluravac finished filling, and that Erickson's thumb had gone up before she made the incision, and that Desjardins had said, "You saved his legs," in the flat, factual tone of someone who does not traffic in exaggeration. She tucked the patch into the pocket of her scrub top. She clocked out at 19:04, the same as any other Thursday. In the parking lot, the CH-146s were long gone. The minivans had reclaimed their spaces. There was a fresh oil stain on the asphalt at the far end of the east lot that hadn't been there this morning. And if you didn't know what had landed there, you wouldn't have known to look for it. Stellan got in her car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the hospital's lit entrance, the automatic doors opening and closing as the evening shift moved through, the fluorescent warmth of the lobby, the ordinary ongoing business of a place that put people back together. She started the engine. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove home the same route she always drove, past the same Tim Hortons and the same traffic light that was always red longer than it should be, and the same stretch of highway where the river came into view between the trees. The patch sat in her pocket, small and heavy and still warm from the trauma bay. She didn't float away from it.